afternoon and welcome to this February 23rd, 2022 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using as our state and community continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. This format enables the City Council to meet and take care of business while keeping everyone safe. For work sessions like this one where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling in to one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm really looking forward to today's work session. As you know, it's one of the topics that our city staff have been all in on, and you've been all in on, and something we get asked about frequently. So really looking forward to a pretty comprehensive presentation on our status of what's happening with our unhoused. And I'm going to kick it over to Christy Hammond, our Assistant City Manager, to lead us off.
Thank you, Sarah. Mayor Vincent, Council. I'm joined at the virtual table today by Matt Rodriguez, our Public Works Director, and Peter Chavon, our Homeless Services Manager. Chief Skinner is also available and will be here if you have questions at the end around things that are related to his service area. So you might recall early last spring, Matt and I came to you with an aggressive plan for thinking big, starting small, and acting fast in response to the growing need for providing services to the unhoused and addressing the challenges that the community was facing. The plan was to act fast in finding ways to have better outcomes for individuals experiencing being homeless and unhoused, and also support our neighborhoods and businesses. You took swift action to approve an ordinance for the establishment of safe sites to accommodate 300 spaces for tents and 200 for vehicles. And just as a reminder, that ordinance does sunset next May without council action to extend it. And we'll be talking a lot about that in the context of some of our financials and the work that we've been doing, but just wanted to flag that for you. The unhoused crisis is just very, very dynamic, and it has always been dynamic. And I think the last 2 years have really taught us quite a bit. It's multifaceted and has required an extensive amount of collaboration with our service providers and partner agencies. And at the heart of really what we do and everything that is important about the work is the people. Everybody is an individual with specific needs, and that is for our unhoused folks who find themselves in those situations for a variety of reasons. Some of them haven't been able to afford rent, some have been in financial crisis, and others may have mental health or addiction and treatment needs. But there is a real individualized approach in doing this work to actually help folks get back on their feet. On the other side is, all of the neighboring neighborhoods and businesses that are also in need of support as they're feeling the impacts of the crisis that we find ourselves in, and trying to figure out how to support them, and doing that work with compassion and understanding, and really trying to balance the needs for public health, public safety, and overall well-being within our community has been a top priority for Matt and I as we've moved through this work with our team. While we've made significant progress in collaboration with providers, we have not yet achieved our goal of establishing the 500 spaces. Well, today you'll receive a full briefing on the status of the implementation, response services, and financials, with specific emphasis on some of the sheltering programs that we have. And Kimbra, could you bring up the slide deck? And we are on slide number 2. So our agenda today is very, very full. Peter will talk a lot about where we are with some of the sheltering and give some specifics in terms of those services. Next slide, please, Canberra. We'll give some assistance with helping us understand what we're accomplishing with the services that we've established. And Matt will talk a lot more about the response, the critical services that city staff are providing, and also the enforcement related response, as it parking, police, things like that you all might be interested in. So the first thing, next slide, please. First thing we wanted to do is just take previous slide, please. So the first thing that we wanted to do is just kind of remind people on the journey that we've been on since the spring of 2020 and the start of the COVID pandemic. You might recall that we moved into fall. At that point, we were operating under an EOC model in COVID response. And in the fall of 2020, Council approved the siting of rest stops and microsites. That's been very, very important along this journey that we had that capacity moving and kind of had that momentum as we moved into the spring of 2021. In 2021, we received, as I mentioned previously, the ordinance and support for establishing safe sleep sites and initiated a parking enforcement plan. And Matt will talk more about that parking enforcement plan a little later. And then in the fall of 2021, it was a real milestone for the work that we'd been doing in the opening of the 310 Garfield site and the council approval of additional safe site locations. And as we move in, as of yesterday, December, Everyone Village became operational. And as of yesterday, the 410 Garfield site started opening. And as of the first day yesterday and reaching out to folks, I believe 5 to 7 people had transitioned to that site, and we'll continue to work on a slow, thoughtful transition to help people do that safely. In addition, one of the other sites that was set up was temporarily was what we refer to as the Hoop site at St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul helped us, and as we were recognizing the site at 13th and Chambers was deteriorating rapidly, and we really needed to find better places for those folks to be. That was a safer place and better for their health and well-being in terms of just the conditions that they were living in. Next slide, please. So just a reminder about the kind of the crisis that we're in across the country. This is probably a familiar map. It was developed in 2020 and I think presented at a national level in 2021, early 2021. The landscape hasn't changed a whole lot. I went and tried to find alternative maps to see if there was some new information and didn't find anything that was actually better or more grounding than this. Oregon and the West Coast continue to be a hotbed for folks that are unhoused. There are a lot of thoughts around that, but you know, I've talked to a lot of experts and no specific reasons specifically related to that. Sort of an interesting piece of information is that in a report done by Eco Northwest in 2019, it highlighted the disproportionate large numbers of homeless populations across the country. And at that time, what I found really interesting is Oregon's general population represented 1.3% of the total US population. And by contrast, the state's homeless population was proportionately twice as large, reaching 2.6% of the US total. So it's just kind of an interesting place that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. This is an update that you're familiar to receiving. It's a state of what's happening locally. So where we are right now as of January, there were 3,136 individuals accessing services logged into the HMIS system. And that's up from where we were last January. The number was 2,488. We're really interested in knowing if some of that has to do with people that are taking advantage of accessing services more and better reporting that we have with our providers in the HMIS system, but continuing to look more into that data. But that's sort of a state of where we are today and how the problem looks to have expanded a bit. Next slide, please. So as we've gone through our journey over the course of the last several months, COVID has been at the forefront of many, many challenges, resulting in staffing shortages that were already, we had a stressed provider system, and finding them even more stressed during the COVID pandemic and their ability to be able to staff up and provide services, especially with the growing need that we have locally. We've experienced increased costs, again, contracting costs due to significant rise in a lot of expenses that our contractors are experiencing and sustaining their workforce. And then the big one that we really have run into over the last year is those supply chain issues and really trying to figure out the timing. We were pretty aggressive in our timeline, hoping to set up a lot of our sites by last December, and the timeline delays and what we've learned from the last several months have really, really been challenging for us on many, many fronts. But we've been able to push through on some of those larger sites, and our partner agencies like Everyone Village and Opportunity Village at Rosa Park or Rosa Village, you'll hear more about that, have also experienced some of those same challenges. Next slide, please. At this point, I'll turn it over to Peter to talk more about shelter.
Thanks, Christy. Good afternoon, Mayor and councilors. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our achievements over the last, really, I'm going to be looking at the last 2 years. Next slide, please. I wanted to start off with kind of a look back at where we were with our shelter inventory in January of 2020, what it looked like after the pandemic began to take hold in our community, where we are currently, and what we're looking at by the end of this fiscal year. So in January of 2020, we had 877 shelter units in our inventory. And I use the term units here to recognize that there are occasions where more than one person may occupy a unit. So if we have a couple, that would be 2 people. But what we're focusing on with this data is the number of units. So in April of 2020, as the pandemic really gripped our community, our inventory dropped to 666, largely due to reductions in inventory at the Dawn to Dawn site, as well as the Eugene mission. Currently, with the addition of our rest stops that we expanded in the fall of 2020 and the safe sleep sites that we've been able to stand up as of today, we're looking at 1,023 units. And then by the end of this fiscal year in June, we're looking at just over 1,100. So the additional units between now and the end of June acknowledge the establishment of the Navigation Center. We look to see that in June, as well as a 40-unit Rosa Safe Sleep site that we're looking to stand up here in the next month. So what I love to say at this point is by June of this year, the City of Eugene and its social service partners will have added 371 alternative shelter units to our community over the last 18 months. Next slide, please. So here you see a map of where shelters currently exist in Eugene. It's dispersed around our community. I think you'll see a map later on that shows where we see people living outside in our community, and it's also dispersed. It's been very intentional on our part to try and create as much geographic dispersion as possible. It's a community-wide problem, and our entire community has a role in addressing it. Next slide, please. Before I provide updates on specific sites, I think it's useful to distinguish between 2 categories of shelter. There are lots of variations within the categories, but as we think about the city's current and future investments, its current and future role in the homeless service system, understanding the implications of the functional differences between the 2 will help us invest strategically. This functional difference essentially derives from how one accesses shelter, which then has implications for staffing levels, outcomes, and costs. The first, programmatic shelters, have a program or culture potential residents affirm prior to entry. There's usually an interview process, and residents commit to engaging with various program components offered by the provider. Here, the shelter culture reinforces community agreements and supports peer-to-peer problem solving. Emergency shelters, on the other hand, are first and foremost an opportunity to access shelter from elements, food, and other basic needs. Individuals access based on a first-come, first-served basis to meet those emergency needs without committing to a community vision. While services are available, there is no requirement to engage in them. Individuals in emergency shelter often require staff support to navigate policies and procedures or to address conflict. Over the last 2 years, the city has expanded both models, first with its rest stop expansion beginning in 2020, and more recently with the Everyone Village 310 and 410 Safe Sleep sites. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the City of Eugene partnered with community-supported shelters and Square One Villages beginning in the fall of 2020 to dramatically expand our rest stop and microsite program. This expansion resulted in an additional 113 units. The slide here on this slide, you'll see where those shelter sites are. Next slide, please. So Everyone Village, driven by the vision of Pastor Gabe Pievich and a longtime advocate for unhoused folk, Heather Selecki, the willingness of Arlene Rexis to provide land, and a coalition of community stakeholders, we have an ambitious venture. Everyone Village aspires towards a multifaceted community that cultivates access to housing, employment, and personal development on site. They are currently working hard to expand to 40 units in the next week to help accommodate people with pets currently residing in Washington Jefferson Park, and have plans to expand further this summer. Next slide, please. The Rosa Safe Sleep Site. So in September of last year, Council approved the transition of the Rosa microsite, originally established as part of the city's rest stop microsite expansion, to a safe sleep site. We continue to work with Square One Villages to develop an operations plan and deploy this site as quickly as possible. We are particularly pleased that Square One Villages is eyeing this location for the development of permanent housing. I'll conclude this update on programmatic shelter with a reminder that thanks to community-supported shelters, Square One Villages, Everyone Village, Council, and of course, federal funding, 193 alternative shelter unit, programmatic shelter units will be available and created by the end of this fiscal year. Next slide, please. So emergency alternative shelters. These are shelters with minimum requirements for entry. Initial priority for residency is being offered to vehicle dwellers in West Eugene. This is for the 310 Garfield site, and people residing in Washington Jefferson Park for 410 Garfield, and the Hoop Project, which housed folks who were previously living in the temporary campsite at 13th and Chambers. The City of Eugene partnership with St. Vincent de Paul has created an additional 178 emergency shelter units. Next slide, please. So 310 Garfield, as Christy mentioned, opened in October of last year with 55 units. To date, more than 130 people have been served at this location. There's an extensive wait list of people wanting to access the site, which affirms our sense that many people living outside will take advantage of emergency shelter when offered. Next slide, please.
How many were on that list?
On the waiting list?
Yeah.
The last count I had was 80. So for the Hoop Project was an emergency response to deteriorating conditions at the 13th and Chambers temporary campsite. City staff had been working closely with Roxanne O'Brien at St. Vincent de Paul and her dedicated team on the development of the 410 Garfield site. And we were talking about how really awful the conditions were at 13th and Chambers. Roxanne, as is her MO, very quickly imagined a potential solution. And with a little workshopping between City of Eugene staff and St. Vincent de Paul staff, we were able to create a viable alternative for people in that campsite. So currently there are 37 units in the Hoop Project. Individuals have access to food, showers, and heat. We are currently evaluating this project for long-term use. Next slide, please. So 410 Garfield, our most recent addition to the Safe Sleep site, As Christy mentioned, that opened yesterday with 86 tent spaces, also providing heat, water, showers, and a daily meal. A partnership with the Eugene Library has facilitated Wi-Fi access to residents. St. Vincent de Paul is currently doing outreach in Washington Jefferson Park over the next 2 weeks to invite people to transition over, after which available spots will be offered to other folks living outside on a first come, first served basis. Next slide, please. So Chase Commons, council approved in September of 2020. We were initially hampered by provider capacity and needed to deepen our community engagement related to this site. Our current intention is to evaluate the integrated impact of the alternative shelter expansion we've made to date, understand available financial resources and provider capacity, identify continued gaps in our community shelter system, and make appropriate recommendations thereafter. Next slide, please. We all know that for many individuals experiencing homelessness, the provision of shelter is only the first step in a response to homelessness, and a successful transition into housing most often requires a suite of services to support people. Lane County has stepped forward to resource medical, mental, and behavioral health support for residents in safe sleep sites, as well as issued requests for proposals from nonprofit providers to deliver housing navigation support. In addition to safe sleep site specific support, Lane County is also partnering with the city and Whitebird to deploy additional street outreach in our community. Next slide, please. While this concludes my update on the Unified Command's shelter expansion activity, I do want to also mention the pending deployment of the Navigation Center in June of this year. As you all know, it's a 75-bed facility with referrals happening through Lane County's coordinated entry system. The City of Eugene has committed $1 million in ARPA funding towards operations, and the building will provide housing navigation services as well as other wraparound services for individuals staying therein. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Matt Rodriguez for further updates.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Matt Rodriguez, Public Works Director. I'm going to share some information with you on our efforts to respond to neighborhood and business needs and help reduce the impacts of unsheltered homelessness experienced during this pandemic. Next slide, please. A quick review of some of the response actions we've taken during the pandemic and especially over the last year to help reduce the impacts of unsheltered homelessness on neighborhoods and businesses. First, we established a unified command structure in April of last year, bringing folks from around the organization to assist with our work to establish new safe sleep sites and better coordinate and resource operations. We provided increased public information and regular communications with service providers, affected neighborhoods and businesses. We created a pilot position called Neighborhood Service Officers that would respond to impacts from vehicle camping and camping in the rights of way. And we currently have 4 folks in those positions. We've increased temporary staff to help manage the increase in calls and provide better customer service. We created a business liaison position in the Unified Command to help provide a central point of contact and address concerns from the business community. And lastly, we've expanded our coordination with the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups. Next slide. So this graph shows the requests for service we've received related to temporary urban camping in parks, tent camping and rights of ways, and vehicle camping during 3 time periods over the last 2 years. So the leftmost column for each area represents calls for service in March of 2020. So that's the darkest blue column, and the left for vehicles, parks, and rights of way. You can see that's relatively low. We have the center column, which is the peak so far of our calls for service that occurred in July 2021. And then on the right, you see a column that shows the request for service from our last full month of data, which was January 2021. Although we had a brief tailing of requests for service related to vehicle camping in the fall of 2021, our overall request for service numbers are still really high, with a slight reduction in vehicle camping and an slight increase in requests relating to tent camping and parks and rights of ways. Next slide, please. A few metrics to share with you regarding the work of the Unified Command and our teams in the field. This is all since July 2021. So we've received over 7,700 requests for service and have completed over 6,000 work orders. And remember that those two numbers will always be different because we often get multiple requests for service for the same concern. We've also collected and disposed of more than 2,500 cubic yards of debris, totaling more than 193 dump truck loads. Next slide, please. Our parking and neighborhood service officers have taken over 1,800 actions related to storage on the streets, issuing almost 1,500 warnings, and those are always preferred to a citation, but they've also issued over 300 citations. Our business liaison, working with traffic operations, parking services, and coordinating with numerous businesses, have worked to implement the parking enforcement plan in commercial and industrial areas, predominantly in West Eugene, as directed by council, and that's resulted in 23 streets receiving new parking regulations and signage. Next slide, please. The Unified Command team has worked more than 25,000 hours since July 1st in total in support of creating new safe sleep sites and reducing the impacts of unsheltered homelessness. This number does not include the hours that Eugene Springfield Fire and Eugene Police Department and other coordinating departments have spent in support of the work. Next slide. We can share that our public safety response has been significant, with over 340 responses by Eugene Springfield Fire to fires related to urban camping. And additionally, Eugene Police Department has responded to more than 4,400 calls for service associated with people experiencing homelessness, with an average of more than 26 calls per day. Next slide. An update on the two large temporary camps. This one shown is 13th Avenue and of course, Washington Jefferson Park. So as you know, in late 21 at 13th Avenue, the site conditions rapidly declined due to rainfall and snow. And our UC team really worked to accelerate finding safe and dry places for people to be at this location. And we were able to work with an amazing team at St. Vincent de Paul to create a temporary shelter in their hoop building at their Dawn to Dawn site. Working with St. Vincent de Paul and other service providers, we were able to offer 56 campers staying at the site shelter. And then we closed the temporary camp in January for restoration, and it's currently under consideration as a future affordable housing site. Next slide. As Peter shared, we're excited to have opened the Safe Sleep site at 410 Garfield. Just an incredible amount of work by our UC team, especially our logistics team, to get that up and running and turn it into a really, I think, a really quality place people can be. Opening 410 Garfield's also allowed us to provide shelter options so that to all the folks that are staying in Washington Jefferson Park, we also have some supplemental options for folks that wouldn't qualify, such as, you know, having a pet. And we found other places that they can be. We plan to close the park after people have transitioned into shelter on March 16th for restoration, with the intent to open the park later this year for public use again. Next slide. So early last year, we established COVID-19 temporary stay-in-place criteria for urban camping. And this guidance was intended to provide people experiencing unsheltered homelessness with clear guidance on what expectations they would need to meet to stay in place when camping on city property. As the pandemic's evolved and we have continued to assess the need for the temporary stay-in-place guidance, we've coordinated with Lane County Public Health and really tried to understand not only COVID concerns, but the trade-offs with other public health concerns that occur when people stay in place living outside, including the effect of unsanitary conditions we see develop at camps regularly. With COVID infection rates and hospitalizations trending down and projected to reduce further in March, and in consultation with Lane County Public Health, we plan to lift our COVID temporary camping stay-in-place criteria in conjunction with the governor lifting the indoor mask requirements and no later than March 31st. Our intention in sharing this information is to provide the community advance notice of this change and clarity on the planned transition. And a few things I really want to clarify about this change. It's unlikely the community is going to see an immediate difference in the number of people camping the day before when the guidance is in place and the day after when it's lifted. our teams have continued to enforce camps that have not met the stay-in-place criteria during the pandemic, largely to the extent of our capacity to do so. Our teams will continue to work to reduce the impacts of unsheltered homelessness, and we're going to use the prioritization framework that we built during the pandemic to help us prioritize the camps for posting and cleanup. And we'll be working with the outreach teams Peter mentioned, which are coming online in March, to understand how they can best work together to address not only community impacts, but provide assistance to people experiencing homelessness. And lastly, we recognize the importance of helping service providers maintain connection with their clients, and we'll continue to explore ways we can work together as we work to provide more safe places for people to stay. With that, I'm going to give it back to Christy.
Thanks, Matt. So this is sort of the last little bit of our presentation has to do with funding. I wanted to provide some context. You might recall that one of the discussions that you had last winter was in the context of sustainable funding for homeless services and sustainability efforts. And so wanted to give you some context for where we are right now. So this slide represents all of the funding sources that we have and that we're utilizing for fiscal year 22, the current fiscal year that we're in. A key thing to think about with this slide is that 77% of the $10.6 million that is appropriated for use this year is one-time dollars. We do have some general fund dollars that are ongoing, as well as one of the bigger significant ones is the CSI dollars that we have. CSI dollars, as you might recall, there's quite a significant component of stabilization dollars that were part of the CSI for programs like rest stops, dusk to dawn, establishment of the downtown resource center, and other services, outreach and things like that, as well as some staffing stabilization. And then there's some dollars for CDBG. But the key thing of that 77%, 91% of those dollars are used for shelter services. So just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please. So this slide, in the context of ongoing and one-time funding, I talked about a few things, but this sort of gives you a breakdown of the 2.4 million and the 8.2. And so as you can see that the vast majority of the things that are in that one-time column are the rest stops, the microsites expansion. The rest stops that we had existing are funded with ongoing dollars, but the things that Peter talked about today with the expansion of those programs are included here. The safe sleep sites, navigation center, the $1 million that was approved for ARPA funding during the supplemental budget process, and then street outreach and shower trailers. And we're learning so much from our providers just how important those shower trailer services are to the services that are being provided to folks. Next slide, please. So this is a big slide with a lot of information, and it's really to provide you with some context of the things that Peter was talking about. As he referred to, when we came and talked with you last spring, our intention was to establish 500 sites, 300 tent, 200 vehicle, to help support the need for emergency and alternative shelter options. The funding models that we used at that time were based upon the programs that we had in place. So primarily the rest stops, dusk to dawn, things like that. And what we've learned over the course of this last several months is that the need of the people who especially need the emergency shelters that Peter was referring to at 310 Garfield, 410 Garfield, and then the Hoop and places like dusk to dawn, the service needs and the way that those services are provided are more intensive in cost. And so we're finding that those are really, really much needed programs because they meet the low barrier thresholds that we've been trying to establish in providing a broad array of services. So this chart breaks down, the first category is the cost for the new rest stops and the microsites. So the annual operations for those sites is around 300,000. The one-time setup was around 620,000, and it established, as Peter talked about earlier, 113 units. And just a reminder that the units can be occupied by more than one one person. So those numbers are generally higher than the unit alone. And then the dollars for the navigation center, $1 million as the center begins to open. The general operating costs planned are somewhere in the $2 million a year neighborhood. That center is slated for opening, as Peter mentioned, the end of June or first part of July. But we believe that the plans are to staff up and start hiring to make sure that it is operational within that timeline. And then the temporary site, which is really the Hoop site or other temporary sites, and the cost of the annual operating costs for that, and then the setup for that cost. And right now, the Hoop site has 37 units. I think Peter referred to that. And so those are the associated costs with getting that established. And the thing that was pretty impressive about that, and what I think Matt and I and others learned a lot about, is just how much we needed to put in place to actually provide services at that site. And I asked at that point, we had a lot of conversations around Lindholm services at the service center. And what we're finding is that service portion is at capacity. They are serving people till well late into the evening, have added staff to make sure people, but it really just cannot take on more capacity. And I think it's something that as we look at the bigger system needs that we'll need to consider addressing in the long run. The next grouping of service costs are related to the safe sites. And so again, the 310 Garfield site with about $600,000, which includes the property lease costs that would be associated with that. Right now, that the use of that property, LTD had provided us with no lease costs up front, but we would start paying those eventually. So it includes the lease costs that we would start paying. And then the initial safe site setup at that location was about $657,000. And as Peter mentioned, there's a long waiting list. There are 55 units there, spaces that are providing services for multiple people. And it was really interesting to get a chance to talk to St. Vincent de Paul and find out how many of those folks are leaving each day to go to work. Their belongings can be safe. They can come back home. They have safe places to cook meals and things like that. So it's been really inspiring to hear about the work happening there. We're really excited about 410. 410 also includes property lease costs. You'll see property lease costs have been a little bit more significant than we had hoped for originally when we started looking for property. You heard us many times come back and talk about the process to find and secure property, and how challenging that turned out to be. So anyways, this number includes those lease costs as well as the one-time setup. The Rosa Village site, which will hopefully be up and running sometime by the end of March. The cost for operating that site annual is $364,000, and the one-time setup costs approximately $170,000. Those are the same numbers for the Everyone Safe Sleep site operations. And then Chase Commons was approved as a safe sleep site, and the funding for that is still available. We have set it aside. We have staff that we want to kind of dig into the programmatic needs. One of the things that we've talked about is that we're really starting to gain some experience with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve at the safe sleep sites, and trying to figure out what is the gap within our system, and how do we make sure that whatever we add provides for, services for that gap. So still on the table, and wanted you to know that there are dollars set aside for those operations. This last section is really speaks to just in general, if we were to add more capacity or expand the safe sleep sites from a vehicle site perspective, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.4 to $2 million operationally for about 125 units, and then the associated one-time setup costs. And then the safe tent sites, again, a range of costs. And that range of costs is based upon programmatic versus emergency, and the staffing and support systems needed in place to help folks. And we'd be happy to answer more questions or provide more details about this information, but at least our intent was to provide some context about the cost, the operational costs associated with these programs. Next slide, please. So our short-term actions, one of the things that we talked about is how close we are to implementing and the safe sleep sites that you all had approved. The one that's still outstanding for us from a programmatic standpoint is the Chase Commons site, and we're going to continue to work on that. So that's one of the priorities that we have, is just bringing all of those up to implementation and seeing how things are going, evaluating and making adjustments as needed. We want to work to stabilize the one-time funding through at least June 30th of 2023. And you might recall that at the start of the meeting, I mentioned that we will need to extend the Safe Site program or ordinance before next May to be able to go beyond that if council feels that that's a successful program to continue with. And then I also wanted to mention that along with that stabilization, you'll see some things that'll probably be coming through in the city manager's proposed budget for fiscal year 23 that will include some discussion about these items, as well as some of the short-term legislative actions that I'll talk about in a moment. And then we want to continue to consult with our stakeholders, providers, people with lived experience to identify and address the system gaps. We know that everything that we're providing probably isn't all inclusive in meeting the needs that are out there. And then lastly, evaluate options for expansion of services. Everyone Village, I think, is poised to expand upon their service model. Matt and I will be joining Councilor Groves on Friday to visit that site again and to talk about the possibilities there. And then there are some other expansion opportunities, I think, that could be considered as it relates to car camping. When Peter mentioned that the last we heard, there were 80 people on a wait list. Those are people that are in RVs or living in vehicles. And as you can tell from a programmatic cost perspective, those might be less expensive to operationalize. Next slide, please. So our long-term focus is going to be on stabilizing services to the greatest extent possible. One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the legislative work that's been happening. As you recall, during your November work session on IGR priorities, Council provided direction to seek long-term funding from the state for unhoused response. During pre-session meetings with local legislators, Mayor Venice and Sarah received clear feedback that the discussion for long-term ongoing funding would not be appropriate for the short session, but a discrete one-time funding request would likely be successful. IGR staff have worked with city leadership to revise this priority item, and with feedback, we identified the need for about a $5 million ask that would be used to fund 3 broad elements of existing initiatives: shelter, support services, and sanitation and cleanup. During the first week of the legislative session in February, we discovered that the City of Portland was also seeking one-time fundings for similar initiatives. Additionally, the governor's housing and homeless proposal of $400 million did not include any funding for cities or homeless services. Within this environment, the IGR staff engaged staff from the 7 medium-sized cities, which Sarah meets with regularly. And this group of 7 cities plus Portland and the League of Oregon Cities pulled together to create a coalition requesting $50 million from the legislature to put into emergency unhoused response initiatives. This coalition approach strengthens our one-time funding ask for this session while creating the groundwork for ongoing discussions related to long-term funding from the state. The $50 million proposal has been picked up by the House of Representatives leadership, and they are including a portion of that request into a larger one-time funding package that is being released either today or tomorrow for consideration within the final budget. The short session moves quickly, and the last day of the session is constitutionally defined. So no later than March 8th, we should have clarification on what state funding resources may be allocated to Eugene. And that's very, very exciting news for us, given the volume of one-time funds that are used to support these services and help us sustain and expand upon what we have. So that's really, really exciting news and great work that's happening. The other thing is that we need to continue to move forward in implementing the homeless pipeline, the HIP, and make sure that the the 500 spaces that we talked about establishing are part of the HIP, but are part of that larger context. And one, helping people not finding themselves unhoused by, rent stability and things like that. And then also, what are the downstream services that are needed to help people move through these systems that are intended to be short-term or emergent. The next thing is working with our community partners to refresh the technical assistance collaborative report and the recommendations to broaden that reach to include a broader community and other service partners and agencies. I think this is going to be a really important part of work that moves forward and really helping people understand where they can plug in and the roles that we all play in supporting this much needed service. And then lastly, we want to continue to evaluate our service programs' impacts. We are establishing a lot of metrics to evaluate the effectiveness of these programs and including that within our contracts to really assess how things are working. Next slide, please. Next slide, last slide. Thank you all very much. We know we took a lot of time. We had a lot of ground to cover. And with that, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you so much. That was such an exhaustive review of the work and really, I think, inspiring. I think, as we go into this year of considering what the next steps are and where our strengths are, and as you identify gaps, it just feels to me as if the work that you have to build on and the information you have to build on is very strong and very helpful. I mean, there's a good foundation for determining what those next steps should be. And I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to turn it over to counselors first. So Randy and then Claire.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Christy, Matt, and Peter. I think that was a very good cut of the information that's been done and a reminder that we have accomplished a lot, but recognizing that there's still a lot of work to do here. And Christy, could you start off for those viewing, specifically, what are we trying to accomplish with our safe street sites? Is it just to get people off the streets or something more? This is a question I'm frequently asked.
Oh, no, I appreciate you asking that. And I would invite, Peter or Matt to chime in as well. But really what we want to do is provide.
Excuse me, could you stop my clock, please? I've got a lot to ask. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Looks like we got stopped. So, really the intention is to provide safe places for people to stay and to connect to services that, so that they can help, so we can help them get what they need to move on to more stabilized environments, whatever the next thing may be from that. But that's really the intention, is to give people safe places in the emergency situation. We find ourselves in a unique role at the City of Eugene in that we are filling a gap of need as it relates to that front end basic service needs that people leave that are finding themselves on the street. And that's what the safe sites are intended to fill.
Thank you, Christy. Everyone Village, as you know, I'm a big fan of the concept and the project, and I think Gabe and Heather are doing a terrific job. One of the things that impresses me with Everyone Village is they are doing more than warehousing. They're actually working to try and lift people up. How does that compare with 310 and consequently 410 Garfield?
Such a great question. So 310 and 410 Garfield, you might remember that Peter referred to those as more of the emergency shelter, and the others that you mentioned were programmatic. And so some of the program providers that we're working with, like Gabe and Heather at Everyone Village, have a really awesome vision that they're thinking about, as does, Dan Bryant and the work that he's doing. And so they all complement each other, right? So if you think about places where people need to start to get, sort of that basic stabilization, they need to start figuring out how to access services. They might not be ready to go into a workforce situation yet, but this is a program, but those emergency shelters help stabilize so they are moving towards a more, independent style of living that they can attain at some of these other programmatic areas. So all of those systems actually, in my opinion, work together to provide an array of service options for where people are at a particular place on their journey to becoming more stable and housed.
Do we have a specific set of outcomes we are seeking and metrics to tell us how we are progressing?
I think I'll defer to Peter for that. He's kind of
clock, please.
Yes, thanks for the question, Councilor Rose. We do. And what we write into our contracts is providers are required to report on this, what we call the self-sufficiency matrix, and that's divided into 4 domains: housing, health or wellness, income, and community engagement. So for example, somebody may enter a program from an unsheltered area. They would show up as a 1 in the housing domain. After 6 months, maybe they're in a Conestoga hut if they're in one of those programs. So that I would have to look at the matrix specifically, but that would be like a 2 or a 3. And then as they move into supported housing, that might be a 4. Market rate housing, that might be a 5. So there's a similar scale in the domains of housing, income, wellness, and community engagement. And so what we'd like to see is how the shelters, alternative shelters that we are financing, how they move people along that continuum.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to parking. The signage that has been put up in West Eugene, along with the enforcement, has been effective. It has made a difference. The faster we can jump on these and maintain accountability, the better. My question is, are there plans to expand the signage into other areas? I see a lot of parking issues still in wards 1 and 7. There's still a number in 8. There's streets that still haven't had the new signage. The original signage, my understanding is it's difficult to enforce, and it's even questionable whether it is discriminatory in nature. And so I want to hear thoughts and plans on that.
I can jump in here. Hello, Councilor Groves, Council. We are working in all these areas to find the right signs to go onto the streets, whether it's commercial vehicle, no parking, 2-hour parking, permit parking. There's a lot of signs there, and all those signs require an administrative process to go through. So we are gathering information and trying to find the best path that works for the businesses, works for the residents, then allows staff to enforce a sign, which is also going to challenge, depending on the type of sign.
Got it. Thank you. And I do understand that, the streets are different and the needs along the streets are different. And I appreciate the flexibility there. I still want to emphasize the need for response and conditioning expectations. One of the things I will say, and I've really appreciated it with neighbors and businesses and workers alike, I think most people do lead in discussing this issue with an element of compassion, but they do expect that the behavioral challenges that we are facing are followed up on. And that's important for everyone's health, safety, and welfare. And it's important for our business community and the workers that they're able to engage in commerce without having undue barriers put in their place. So, the compassion with the expectations, and as I've shared before, there are actual businesses that have sponsored unhoused people on their properties to support. And I'm going to need a second round, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Claire and then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Christy and Peter, for that pretty exhaustive update on all the incredible work that staff has been doing. And there's a lot of unsung heroes of staff work buried within that report that those of us who field a lot of requests for service from our constituents are aware of. So I really want to thank the whole team. And I'm so pleased that 410 Garfield is open and that this council has supported moving ahead with these safe sleep sites and supporting staff in the work that they've been doing. I think we don't want our safe sleep sites to be around forever, but we do need them for right now. And I think they are providing safe, stable housing for people in need. And that's what we need to be offering so that we can begin to enforce on our, prohibited camping ordinance in a way that other residents of our community expect us to. And so I can say I have a lot of constituents who are going to be really happy to see the campers leaving Washington Jefferson and the and the park being closed for a while there's restoration done there. And I also have folks who are concerned about the people who will not want to be going to one of our safe sleep sites and who are going to be moving on, who have already moved on to the surrounding planting strips and sidewalks. And that's in addition to people who had already been camping in various places throughout our community. So I've shared that concern with staff already. And, they are, acknowledge the limitations on capacity in terms of responding for calls for service, but that calls for service, will be responded to. I'm hopeful that these first few numbers of residents that are in these various shelters that we've set up will find their way into permanent housing or better housing situations in the next few months due to the stability and connection to navigation services that they'll have there. And that will open up spots for more people. I did want to hear more about the neighborhood services officers and what department they'll be housed within.
Thank you, Councilor Syret. So the neighborhood service officers are parking officer pluses is another way to think about them. So they are in the planning and development department and the parking services program. We have funding for 4 officers, 4 of our internal parking officers promoted into the position. They enjoy doing the work and interacting with the community. And so we have 4 officers that are supporting neighborhood livability, working with the Unified Command. They seek compliance in a right-of-way, they build relationships with our community, and they're having success as they do their job out in the community. So I'm happy to answer any other more specific questions, but it is a pilot that we have right now, our agreement with AFSCME, and we're hoping to continue having that classification going forward.
Great, thanks.
Okay, Mike and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. I continue to believe, based on the things I read and hear and see and conversations I have with people who deal with homelessness on a one-to-one basis every day, that a great majority of it is driven by drug use. Ballot Measure 110 dedicated more resources or a responsibility to the state to take greater drug treatment opportunities in each of our cities. Can someone speak to the state's progress or success at that so far?
Chief Skinner, do you have any information to provide? I bet he got called into other business. He's so busy. I don't have any information off the top of my head. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any. Sorry, I'm in training all day, so I'm sitting in my car. So I apologize for the video and the audio. I don't have any updates on that. We are getting together as a group, not only for our annual conference this spring, but we have a homeless policy team group that is made up of a variety of chiefs of police from all over the state. And that has not convened for some time. And so once that gets reconvened, I think better information from that more broad perspective will be available, sir.
I appreciate the police officers statewide in addressing this and following up, but I wonder, is this a topic of conversation at our IGR? Are we dealing with this as a whole city appropriately to hold the state to their responsibility? Sarah, maybe? I don't know.
I'm going to have to get back to you on that because I don't know what the most recent conversations were. I don't recall that being in our IGR legislative priorities, but I have to go and look at that.
again, I believe this is one of the key problems that drives homelessness, and the state has a responsibility to act and help us. And I hope it becomes a bigger priority to hold their feet to the fire. Number two, Peter mentioned a wellness continuum and the scoring process for folks as they travel along that. Peter, I'm wondering if you could answer for me, what percentage of the homeless population that you deal with, that you have connection to through outreach or otherwise, don't want to take advantage of those opportunities provided to move forward on the wellness scale? What would be the percentage of those you come into contact with?
I don't really know how to answer that question, Councillor Clark. You know, I think people are, when they're resistant to what we call resistant to services, I think it's less that they're resistant to services and more that they're resistant to the loss of agency in enrolling in programs.
Or said another way, perhaps they're not interested in following the rules associated with those services. Would that be accurate?
Right, and I wouldn't necessarily say with those services. Again, I would point to the loss of agency they perceive. And so one of the reasons emergency shelters are useful is people will access an emergency shelter without accessing a programmatic. They don't want to get involved in the programmatic shelter. I'm cold, I'm hungry, and I want to shower. And so I'll access an emergency shelter, and I'm going to go in on a short-term basis just to get cleaned up, get some food, and I'll be there for a couple of days, and then I'm out. But what happens when they're in those emergency shelters, there's an opportunity to develop a relationship with someone that gives them a reason to hope. For the part of the population that you're talking about, they feel disenfranchised and marginalized by the community. And you know, we can debate whether they should or they shouldn't. The reality is they are. And so to get them to imagine a different possibility, oftentimes that takes the relationship building work that we talk about pretty regularly in homeless services.
I want to jump in right there and just say, this is different than the question I asked. And the reason is because I have a different sort of, the policy questions that are layered into the response there are, what's the appropriate way to respond to someone who does not want to get well in this definition? And you're suggesting that creating a better relationship is the appropriate way. I'm not certain I agree with that. And so what I'm looking for is just information. What's the percentage of people who say, no, you know what, I don't want to abide by the rules of the program. I'm not interested.
I don't have that information, and I don't know. I mean, I can check in with Lane County. I don't know that we have a good database that could provide you with that information.
So we're not requiring anything of folks. I mean, after they stay at the emergency shelter, they can turn around next day and take off, and we don't require anything of them?
At the emergency shelter, that's correct, yes.
Do we require people not to use drugs or not to be at effective drugs in emergency low barrier shelters?
We do. There is a no illegal drugs in our emergency shelters. And if providers observe behavior that suggests illegal drugs are being used, they will act according to their policies and procedures, which, you know, depending on the level of offense, there are a variety of consequences that are associated with that.
Cool. So from a policy perspective, we have some folks who won't seek emergency shelter in the first place because of if they're in need of drugs more pronouncedly than they are in need of shelter, they're not seeking it. And B, then there are some percentage of people unwilling to seek the opportunity for wellness because no one is suggesting that it is a necessity to them. Would that be accurate?
Well, certainly people would be suggesting that it's a necessity, but we don't compel people.
That's what I'm looking for.
Right.
I'm going to need a second round, Mayor. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you. Alan and then Emily.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Christy and team, for this very comprehensive overview. Really kind of pulls it all together. Lots of good work being accomplished here. Going from 666 to 1138 sites or units is quite an accomplishment, actually, in a very short period of time. And it's not just shelter. In most of the circumstances, except for the emergency stuff, we're actually combining services to get people towards stability. So trying to get them to be able to be stable. And I'm always struck by the number of people that have gone to Opportunity Village that have actually transitioned to stability. So I know that model actually works. We just need to be able to fund it and make sure it gets followed through on. It's great that we're finding spaces for people in 13th and Washington Jefferson Park sites as we close those and then rehab them. And it's great that the NAV Center is going to open in June. That's been a long time coming. Maybe for the record, you can clarify what request for services means in all this. It's not people requesting sites. Maybe you should clarify that for folks.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Zelenka. So requests for service are basically the way that any community member can request service. If someone sees a unsanctioned camp in the right of way, they could put a request for service into Public Works Maintenance. If they see a branch down in the street, they can put down a request for service. It's basically the way we collect information on concerns from the community that we respond to.
So it's really concerns and complaints, as opposed to people wanting, they want a service from us to deal with this issue, right?
That's correct.
As opposed to homelessness services requests, which is different. All right. Can you pull up slides 32 and 33? Those are the funding and the cost slides. The 32 has the slide that has funding for shelter and supportive services, and it said ongoing funding $2.4 million and one-time $8.2 million. And then on 33, that's the chart with all the program costs. And my question is that 2.4 of ongoing funding already assumed, or is that, should we net that out from the bottom line here, which is 2.6 to 4.6 million?
Well, most of what we were showing you on that larger chart are the newer programs that we have. So for instance, we do have that $1 million set aside as part of the supplemental 1 budget process. So on that first category, and I don't know, Canberra, if you're able to pull up the slide deck or not, but on the first category with the new navigation, so all of these things that are on here are all new and not part of like the CSI funding. So CSI funding, you might recall that we used to fund rest stops, dusk to dawn with one-time money over and over and over again. And so a lot of the dollars for CSI went to the stabilization of those services, so that the funding was ongoing. Is that getting at your question? So
if I got that right, so this chart on 33, the 2.6 to 4.6 million is on top of the 2.4 of ongoing funding. This is the need above and beyond that, correct?
Well, the ongoing need is probably more of the 8.2. Yeah, the 8.2 million. Yes.
Yeah. And go to the next slide if you could. Okay. So all of this kind of underscores the importance of the work session I called for, which is a dedicated funding source for homelessness and climate change services. Because I mean, this clearly shows that we're gonna have a pretty big here. One last question: can you explain a little bit more detail about what the issues are at the Chase Commons?
Well, initially, one of the things that we bumped up against is that we didn't have a provider. And with the number of people that we had working to get some of the safe sites set up, it was our logistics team was completely tapped, just kind of the resources that we had available. And so we focused on the things that were in motion and wanted to come back to this. And the other thing is that we want to continue to, as we think about programmatically what's needed and what makes sense, we also want to make sure that we're working with the neighborhood and the surrounding businesses to make sure, we're kind of working in step together to make sure that there's good neighbor agreements in place and things like that are really well established and we've used at other sites. So it's getting back and revisiting what exactly is the gap that's needed, how can that site potentially fill that gap, and what does that look like, and then working with the surrounding neighborhood and community.
And we can't do that because we have a capacity issue. I'll need another round, Mayor.
It's mostly just the amount of staff that we have to implement so many things at once. Right.
Yeah, thanks. Another round, Mayor, please. Thank you.
Got it. All right, Emily and then Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Christy and Matt, and the incredible numbers of hours our staff have put in. I really appreciate this report, the depth of it, and the breadth of how many things it covers. Really good job with that. I'm going to be using that to talk to people. It's astounding, really, how many sites we've put in place since we started. And I know it's not the 500 that we're aiming for. And it's at the top of everybody's mind in the whole city. What are we doing about homelessness? And I just want to point out that this is almost an insurmountable task, and we've made a really lot of progress in it. We are helping people in emergency. It's costing us a ton of money. This is really distressing. And on top of people maybe not realizing how much we're doing, they may not realize how much it's costing. And then that means we don't have that money for other services that people need. I'm not saying we shouldn't spend that money. I just think people need to realize that this is such an enormous problem. It's affecting everything else in the city. The rest stops. I love the rest stops. And from the charts, it looks like they're much more affordable than, and I know we need emergency, but a much more affordable way of helping people. And knowing some people in them, I appreciate the sense of community that they give each other, and that they have a pretty good success rate of getting people housed. Everyone Village, I'd like us to try to model that a little more, because they're going beyond even what our rest stops are doing as far as getting people trained and able to be in the greater community. Showers, yeah, let's get those shower trucks. I know that they're expensive, but if you smell bad, you've got instant stigma. People will not help you as much. So showers and laundry, I think, elevates people to a better place of being able to cope. Really concerned about one-time funding. Again, that money is desperately needed, and where are we going to get it from? I also like to point out to people that a lot of money is coming from the CSI, and that is not gone just to police coverage. So I know that's controversial for a lot of people, but it is making a difference. And I am also concerned about what happens as people disperse back into the community. You know, I worry about downtown a lot, but certainly the neighborhoods. And I would like to see shelters and help spread out more across the city. I do feel like the downtown, 1st and 7th wards and out west with 6th and 8th, we need more help. Sorry, I went over. Thanks.
That's okay. Jennifer, and then we'll do second rounds.
Thank you. So first, just thank you for this report. It is astounding how much work is happening from staff and from all of the organizations that we're working with throughout the country, throughout the area. It's a lot. And it sometimes, I think, putting it on paper doesn't give it justice to how many little things are happening to make this huge system. And yet this report also makes me very anxious, because $8.2 million of funding that's just going to end at some point is huge, and something that our community is not going to be capable of coming up with. I don't see that number happening. We are not a rich community. So when Mike talks about ensuring that our partners are pulling their share, I think that's a really important thing to make sure. And I'm really happy to hear that staff has been working with other communities to try to get us the funding that we need from the state. I mean, that's fantastic if it happens. So Christy, maybe you can tell me when does, let's say we don't get money, when does our money run out?
So one of the things that we're in it with a lot of these programs is a lot of transitions. And so we really wanted to have a slide in the slide deck that said this is exactly when it runs out. So we have on our Safe Site service contracts, we have those extended through the life cycle of the ordinance, right? So those would expire at that time, and the funding will probably coincide with running out about that time too. Our goal is that we try to get through FY24, so we can move through the long-term session of the legislature. We'll have more discussion at the budget level locally to talk about things. We'll be having more conversation with community partners that we start to engage around the pivot or the refresh of the TAC, and how do we bring all of our, so I think the one-time money is concerning. There's no doubt about it. It's something that I lose sleep over, because I'm just like, these things are so important to our community and to the individuals accessing the services. And it's a way to help them network into other parts of the system. And at the same time, that availability of those one-time dollars is giving us a pathway to find that backup solution, and also evaluate the strategies to say, these are some expensive strategies. Is there a different way of doing them that will be some economy of scale? And so, that's something that Peter is really diving into. And so we find ourselves thinking of 18 to 24 months out. What we have today might look a little different based upon, what we learned from this experience and working with the providers about how we deliver the service and where we need to grow parts of the model and where we need to pull back. And so I don't know if that really answers your question, but really probably by the end of, but coincides with the time of the ordinance is probably at this point. And that's assuming some conversation during the FY23 budget process and seeing what happens with the local, the legislative process.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. And I think staff have done a good job of adjusting as time has gone by. So I'm glad to hear you guys are still working on that. I would expect nothing less. We talked a little bit, I think, with Peter about folks who are dealing with addictions. And obviously we know if you could just turn it off, it wouldn't be an addiction. So it sounds like we still haven't really found a good solution for those folks who need to get stable, but are also dealing with a very real addiction. Is that probably accurate?
Peter may want to weigh in on this, but just a reminder about the navigation center, that's going to play an important role in helping people stabilize. The other conversation that's underway that some of us are engaged in right now pretty heavily is the mental health crisis center, and the goal to get that operational and continuing to figure out how to support that. That will also provide some better services to people that are in crisis to help. And so I think there's some things in the work. But Peter may have some additional adds to that from a day-to-day perspective and operations.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I think you all have picked up on the rest stops were a really economical response to our housing crisis. And one of the so there are two reasons why we haven't just really gone after that model. One, our rest stop operator, community supported shelters, is still recovering from the rapid expansion we did last fall. And then two, what they're seeing is the level of mental and behavioral health supports people who are applying to their program are experiencing exceed their expertise. And so we know that Lane County is trying to generate additional resources in that area, but that continues to be a major challenge within the unhoused community.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand why it would not always work in all the places that we have, right? You need the right place for the right needs. And I'm glad to hear that the Navigation Center is going to be able to address some of that. It's a serious concern to get. If you can't get stable, how can you deal with issues? It just made sense to me. So I'm glad we're still working on that. What else do I have? I think that is it for now. Thank you.
Okay, Greg, you're up.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation. I thought it was extremely comprehensive and very impressive. Here's my question. It's a little bit higher level in terms of coordination with our other governmental partners. And probably, I would say that Ethan probably, and I know Ethan is not here, he's up in the legislature doing work for us, but probably have some more answers to this question. But Christy, what does it look like for us in terms of our long-term ability to be able to provide these services, support these services over an extended period of time with help and ask from the federal level as well as the state level? I know the state is grappling with the same economic issues that we are in terms of not having enough revenue and not having enough budget to be able to address the human services needs that we have. But I was hoping that during this last year that we would have a more proactive response from the federal level in terms of how we can coordinate and fund over a longer term basis the needs that we have out there, not only for emergency shelter and affordable housing, but for the maintenance of that shelter and that housing, because what we have had before in the past, going back to the 1930s, was we built housing, we built projects, we put people in those places because they had no place to live, and then they weren't maintained. And because they weren't maintained, eventually, a few years ago, most of them were blown up, destroyed, and then that population either went into the streets or were redistributed into other living accommodation vis-a-vis Section 8. So what are our conversations with our federal partners and coordinating that with the state and the county so that, people understand that this is a joint effort and it's a mutual effort that is moving forward on all levels of government?
Sarah, I saw you leaning in, but I'll jump in. And if you have, I know you're in more conversations, we have to learn from our history. I really appreciate you bringing up that perspective. And when we're not thinking about the total cost of the services, it can cause a lot of problems. What I understand is that in preparing for the United Front trip that's coming up this spring, that homeless response and services are a key component of, some of the asks and conversations that we intend to have back there. We're working closely with our regional partners, Lane County and the city of Springfield, in preparation for that trip. And our local delegation at the state level has just been, all in and thinking about how to recognize the need. They're recognizing the need and trying to figure out how we solve it together. And I think what people are realizing is that this problem can't be funded solely at a local level. The problem is beyond the means of the municipalities. And so the work that Sarah's doing with the city manager group that she meets with regularly, and Ethan is doing phenomenal work, and many of you are also involved in talking with the legislative delegation and really helping them understand the depth of the need that we have for funding. And so I think on all fronts that you were referring to, those conversations are happening and will be moving forward. And right now, I think Ethan is just trying to get us through the short session and make sure that the legislature has what they need to know about our needs, the information they need to make decisions to help deciding how to distribute dollars to our area. So it's happening, and we can keep you posted, and I'd be happy to have Ethan give you more information. And Sarah, if you have anything to add, I'm not sure.
I have one other question there, Christy. Speaking of the United Front, are we planning to have meetings with HUD or HUD leadership? I mentioned that because I do have a direct connection to the Secretary of HUD. So
I see the mayor shaking her head. Yeah, so I think that it's generally on the list of folks to meet with. So.
Okay, thank you. We are almost at time. I have 3 counselors, so if you each want to do a kind of a rapid round, I have Randy, then Mike, then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. And I appreciate you, Christy, and others who have said this. This is bigger than a Eugene problem. This is a regional problem. It's a state problem. It's a national problem. We are a collection point like other communities along up and down the West Coast. Christy, do we have any way of, or any form of metrics to measure the performance of our nonprofit providers?
You know, I will have to get back to you on that. I think that there are mechanisms in place with the different contracts that, you know, if a lot of times if they're receiving any sort of funding from the county or from the city, there are metrics associated with that. But I could go back and talk with our partners at the county and get more information if that would be helpful.
I think that that's important. I think we should understand that as a council to know what we're getting for the large amount of money we are spending. I have a number of questions, but in the interest of time, I'm really going to try and shave this down. One of the questions / points I want to make is housing people in large RVs and trailers is the least efficient way of providing housing. It costs more because they take up a larger footprint as compared, you take a 40-foot RV, you can fit 3 micro houses in that same footprint. Do we have a way to try and entice people out of these RVs, which based on the ones I've seen, I don't consider them habitable. I don't think they're a healthy environment versus moving them into a micro shelter. Is there any work being done around that? Because it would certainly help us extend our limited and available space.
I think that's part of the work that Peter's wanting to do is sort of as things start settling in, we have a whole, you know, the 310 site is all RVs and vehicles and trying to figure out what's working for them, what also could maybe replace that so that we could get rid of some of those vehicles that, well, it's their home, maybe get them to a better home or housing situation. And so I think we're looking at all of those things when we talk about examining the need to examine the programs that we have in place to find out their effectiveness and do we need to pivot. That's the kind of thing that we'll be looking at.
Thank you, Christy. And then just one last point for the mayor. Mayor, I hope you will have an opportunity at some point to update council as with the work you're doing with Mayor Wheeler in Portland to try and go after some of this. I think that's a really, really important part of this conversation and the work. And I do appreciate you stepping up and taking that on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. I've got Mike and then Alan.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to be really clear after my first round that I think staff is doing a phenomenal job. I think that what you guys are doing is a Herculean effort, and everybody associated with this work is doing a fantastic job of implementing the policy that council sets. And that's the differential here for me, is that it's our job to decide the policy approaches, and it's you guys' job to implement them. And you're doing that part exceptionally well. My issue is I'm trying to highlight, I think, what are failures in our policy approach. And that's for council to decide. I think the most glaring policy failure that we have is that we're spending $10.6 million. Isn't that the number that I saw as the total? Christy? Yeah, $10.6 million, a lot of which is coming from outside of the city organization. But if we don't end the demand, then that money is going to have to come from somewhere else. And I suspect we'll be in conversations about it coming more and more and more from the general fund, where I think the general public would expect that we have a plan to ramp down that expenditure and succeed at not having the demand that we have. I think one of the biggest failures of that is that we have no policy in place to require people seek wellness. And I think and we don't even know how many of those we serve are not interested in following the rules of the program set up and not seeking treatment for their addiction or their mental health issues, or not being willing to participate in the basic sorts of behaviors that society expects of people in it. And so my big problem is our lack of expecting accountability from those who are offering to help. And the offering to help part is great. I think we should be providing paths to wellness for everyone who wants it. But I think our failure is that we don't require it of everyone who is living off of the public in this way and causing other expenses to the public in this way. And we need to develop those policies to have a rounded program that can succeed. Thank you.
Okay, Matt, I see you around for a first round, and then Alan, I'll give you a second round.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thanks for the presentation, and apologies for participating telephonically. And forgive me if this question has been asked earlier. I've been in and out of the vet with Vegas today. Has there been conversation this afternoon or within the unified command structure about deploying physical and or online information about where persons most in need could access, and communication about or distributing cards, maps, website info, phone numbers, etc. I receive these updates regularly and relatively in the know, and yet I'm largely unaware of where all the specific sites are open at certain times and where they're all located throughout our community. And it's even more confusing as each site seemingly has a different moniker, making it difficult to know what's what and who's who. So forgive me if that's been covered. It makes me think of the statewide work that 211 have been doing, and Whitebird locally. And I'm just curious about the coordination with the aforementioned, and uncertain about the aforementioned funding level and their coordination with our local communities. I applaud the additional 1,138 beds. How are we getting that information out to our most vulnerable community members to let folks know where to go? Thank you.
Councilor Keating, just real quick. Yes, we did not cover communications and outreach tools that we're making available. We're doing a website refresh to try to have that be a more interactive site and not just information, but trying to make that more useful to people that are looking for services. We do a lot of handouts that we provide to people, especially when we're in conversation about different transition opportunities available to them, and provide them not only with the primary, like in the case of WJ, the primary site that we have available is 410, but we also have other service providers there that may recognize that there are other services available that would be better suited for those individuals. And so there's a personal touch with a lot of the providers that are helping with this work. And then there's also the handouts that we put together to help keep people informed. And we're continuing to look for ways to enhance a more robust system as it relates to using technology to access information. So we really appreciate you championing that for us and being the voice, a consistent voice in making sure that work continues.
Okay, Alan, one more quick comment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you said, Mike. Actually makes a lot of sense, except for one problem, which is once we get to wellness, we don't have any services to get them there if we required it. We're 50th out of 50 states in in substance abuse addiction services. We're 51st in mental health per capita spending, behind Guam. And surprisingly, there's just not a lot happening at the state level, at the legislature. I'm wondering if this is a high priority ask for the IGA, and shouldn't we be making that a big part of what we need to see in order to solve this? Because homelessness is a symptom. The problems are addiction services, mental health services, or mental health and affordable housing. And those three things are what solves this. Sarah, are we working on this at the IGA?
Oh, actually, I could jump into this comment briefly and to say that that in terms of our specific policy asks for this short term, the legislature, no, other than our advocating for extension of homeless services. I think in the long term, as we're working with the county on, as they're developing the mental health crisis center, as we're working on the county of revisiting the TAC report and what do we need to do? Yes, absolutely. And I think because the county is the home of Lane County Behavioral Health, I see that primarily as their dollar ask, but we support them, would benefit from those services. So others may have other thoughts about that, but I think absolutely, I mean, it's a top priority. And
yeah, I think it really needs to be a top priority for us moving forward to addiction and mental health services. The question I had was efficiency metrics. A lot of people say, how do we know we're spending our money effectively? And maybe this is a longer term conversation, not for today, but how do we know we are spending our dollars in an effective and efficient way to deal with the homelessness issue and the services? I don't want you to answer that, but maybe you can get that back to us in an email or something like that. And then just finally, just to underscore, just to maintain what we've built here, this hard-fought system that we've built, which seems to be working in a lot of ways, but deficient, is $5 million of ongoing funding in the hole that we don't have. And we need partners to be able to do that. We can't do this all by ourselves, but we need to step up to the plate too. So underscoring the need for some dedicated funding for this from different sources.
okay, Greg, one last comment, and we really have to wrap this up.
I know we're running over time, Mayor, but I don't want to step on Chair Syret's toes here, but I will say this. As far as IGR is concerned, the mayor is absolutely correct. We have not been focused on this for the short session. I think we're going to have to take a step back after the session is over with and have a very long look and conversation about how we approach the next long section of legislature in 23 in terms of this issue, and also how we work together with our other municipal partners vis-a-vis the League of Oregon Cities. Everybody, as Alan has pointed out, has this issue. It doesn't matter whether you're in Portland or Redmond or Ashland or Cave Junction. We are all facing this. It's getting worse. It's getting out of hand. We don't have a lot of solutions to it. And we don't need just money and resources from the state, but we need to have a strategic way of addressing this in a long-term format so that we can not only reduce the level of homelessness and the lack of affordable shelter that we have right now, but that we can ultimately increase our capacity so that the people that live in our community and across our state can have healthy, safe places to live and something that they can afford to pay as far as rent. And I'm not talking about 50+% of their income.
Okay, thank you. And Claire, one more.
Well, thanks, Mayor. I have many things to say about many of the things my fellow counselors have said, but we're way over time, and I'm the chair of the IGR, which is supposed to be meeting already. And that is the role in which I'll speak right now. Thanks, Councilor Evans. I think that if members of this council want your IGR to prioritize lobbying on mental health and substance abuse support dollars, then this council will need to take a position on that, which we have not so far. So I will just put that out there. It's fine that individual counselors might want us to do that, but that is not a position for the IGR. So we would need to have a council level discussion on making that a priority. And I'll just, I guess the other thing I'll take advantage of to say, Councilor Groves gave kudos to our mayor for joining Mayor Wheeler in the coalition work. I will note that our mayor is now leading that coalition work, and rightly so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for all of your comments and all of the work. And I will just say a couple of things, which is, I started with this comment about the excellence of this work is that it puts us in a position to begin to answer a lot of the questions that you are asking. And so we are on that solid ground. You know, also recognizing that by June and by this time next year, the 75-bed shelter navigation center will have opened. A number of these other things will have opened, and we will begin to see a little more clearly how effectively people actually move along, who have stepped into an emergency shelter, who have moved on to Everyone Village, or who moved on to Rosa Village, or any of these other. We'll begin to see, so we'll have some of those metrics. And just a thought for you as we move forward and think about where are we going to be in 2 years when these federal dollars run out. And so you are right, the ask is at the state level and it's at the federal level. And those are structured asks that we'll all be a part of, sort of orchestrating that conversation and what we think we need. I do work with other cities to make federal asks as well. And so all of that is kind of part of that bigger picture. There are different metrics. I mean, right now we're in an emergency situation and our metric is, do we get people out of the mud, right? Are we saving people from getting into the emergency room? In the long term, we don't want to be in that downstream position. You know, we want our metrics to be how brief and rare is homelessness. That's what we want our metrics to be. Right now, we just got to get people out of the mud. And so I think 2 years down the road with the metrics that we have and the planning you have an opportunity to do around here to prioritize how much do we have to devote towards those emergency responses and how much are we devoting towards those programmatic responses? And what is that relationship with the county in terms of what the county is investing in? So I just think we're in a great place to have that conversation. We will have the data. And so I really appreciate all of the questions that you all have been asking today and very much appreciate the many, many people working for the city of Eugene who have put their heart and souls and good brains at work to do this. So thank you all very much. And with that, we are adjourned.
I took you up on your motion, Clara, sent it out.